Good morning, my dear students. Today we are going to continue with our lesson, A Triumph of Surgery. Yesterday I told you that Mr. Harriet carried Tricky to his surgery. On reaching the surgery, he placed Tricky on one carpet. Tricky lay there dull and motionless. There were so many other dogs at the surgery. They came and sniffed Tricky but ignored him because they found him to be very uninteresting. Tricky got a warm, loose box for himself, which was kept among the other dogs. Tricky was under 2-day observation. In these 2 days, Tricky did not get any food, he got only water. Mr. Harriet took personal care of Tricky, he kept an eye on him. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third day, he started to produce low sounds of pain when he heard the other dogs. On the same day, there was a greyhound called Joe. The meaning of greyhound is a dog's breed. Greyhounds are generally tall and slender and they are very powerful. So at the surgery also there was a greyhound and its name was Joe. Joe along with the other dogs came near Tricky. He rolled him over and inspected him, but this time too they were disappointed because there was nothing interesting in Tricky. They left Tricky there, they moved off down the garden. Surprisingly, Tricky got up. Tricky saw the group moving away. He felt like following them, and with his surplus fat, he rolled. Somehow he followed the group. Here in this lesson, feeding time needs a special mention. There is a servant called Tristan. This servant serves the food in 2 bowls, and usually there is a headlong rush at the meal time because every dog knows it very well that if he is left behind he will have to face a lot of competition, and sometimes he may even miss his meals. All the dogs had their food, they left the place. Tricky arrived in the place. He took a walk around the empty bowls. He licked in 1 or 2 bowls. By this, Mr. Harriet understood that Tricky could not have his meal, and he arranged an extra bowl for Tricky for the next day. Then on, Tricky began to show a rapid progress. Mr. Harriet did not give any medical treatment to Tricky. There was a natural cure for Tricky. Mr. Harriet allowed Tricky to be mixed and mingled with the other dogs. Mr. Harriet allowed Tricky to run about with the other dogs, to play with the other dogs, to fight with the other dogs. And soon, Tricky became an accepted member of the gang. All the dogs at the surgery accepted Tricky. Here, 2 activities of Tricky need special mention. Number 1, you have to remember, my dear students, number 1 activity. Tricky learned to fight like a tiger for his share during meal time. And during night time, Tricky, along with the other dogs, ventured out into the old hen house where he hunted mice. This was really a wonderful time in the life of Tricky. He had never had such a beautiful time in his life. At Mrs. Pumphrey's house, he was totally pampered and there was no companion for him. But here there were so many other dogs among whom Tricky felt at home. Tricky was really doing wonderful. But on the other hand, Mrs. Pumphrey was very much worried. She was anxious. She kept on calling Mr. Harriet to know or to get information about Tricky's health, and she asked plenty of questions whether Tricky's cushions and coats were properly put to use. Generally, Mr. Harriet avoided to answer such questions because he had never used any of Tricky's cushions and coats. But he could tell Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky was doing well, he was out of danger, and he was convalescing. The word convalescing had an impact on Mrs. Pumphrey. What do you mean by convalescing? Convalescing means it's a recovery period of a patient. It's a recovery stage of a patient. In this period, in this stage, a patient should have nutritious food in order to build up his health. So Mrs. Pumphrey knew it very well. So when Mrs. Pumphrey heard the word convalescing, that her Tricky was convalescing, she decided to provide plenty of nutritious food to Tricky. And then she started to send round and fresh eggs, 2 dozens at a time, to the surgery. But as soon as Mr. Harriet and his partners received the eggs, instead of giving those eggs or instead of feeding Tricky with those eggs, they gulped them down. They ate them, 2 eggs each, at the breakfast. After a few days, wine started to arrive. In order to enhance Tricky's blood, Mrs. Pumphrey meant to enhance Tricky's blood by sending wine to the surgery. But here again, Mr. Harriet and his partners took wine that was meant for Tricky. 2 glasses of wine before lunch and 2 glasses of wine after lunch. Their lunch had become a ceremonial occasion. They were having really a very good time. And after a few days, brandy started to arrive. Mr. Harriet remembers those were the days of contentment. Those were the days of satisfaction. And they, Mr. Harriet and partners, tempted to keep Tricky as their permanent guest, because they were starting their day with eggs, they were refreshing with wine in the afternoon, and they were finishing their day with brandy. Those days were really wonderful for Mr. Harriet and his partners. Of course, those days were wonderful for Tricky as well, because he was getting a right kind of treatment. But Mr. Harriet could not see the sufferings of Mrs. Pumphrey. Therefore, he decided to call her up, ring her up, and asked her to collect her dog, because it is awaiting collection. Well, within a minute, Mrs. Pumphrey's car came at the surgery. For car, here in this lesson, a very good phrase has been used. I am going to read this phrase for you. 30 feet of gleaming black metal. So Mrs. Pumphrey's car was almost 30 feet length. So it shows that Mrs. Pumphrey was really a very rich lady. So the car was standing, it was stopped in front of the surgery. Mr. Harriet went there. The chauffeur means driver opened the door of the car. Mr. Harriet tried to find out Mrs. Pumphrey, but she was lost in the interiors of the car. But still, somehow, Mr. Harriet could find Pumphrey. Pumphrey was clasping her hands like this. When we are in tensed condition, we clasp our hands. She was also in tensed condition. She was trembling, and she asked Mr. Harriet, "Is he all right?" For which Mr. Harriet replied that, "You need not come out of the car. I myself will go into the garden. I'll bring Tricky for you." So he went into the garden. Mr. Harriet, he saw Tricky among the other dogs. Tricky was flapping his ears and wailing his tail. This creature, within 2 weeks, had transformed into a lead, transformed into a hard-muzzled animal. He picked him up and took him to the car. As soon as Tricky saw his mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey, he leapt and sailed onto the lap of Mrs. Pumphrey and started to lick her face and bark. Mrs. Pumphrey was really contented, satisfied, and while her car was moving away, she looked at Mr. Harriet and exclaimed, "How can I thank you, Harriet? This is really a triumph of surgery." Thank you very much, students. Have a nice day. The lesson has finished.